My love of knitting and crafts came from a childhood where I was exposed to these skills by the people I loved the most. Here is one of the stories that shaped me into the knitter I am today. The Knitting Club and Measuring Day. Every summer, my mother would pack up my sister and off we would travel across the Atlantic on a plane to visit my grandparents in northern England. We were making the long trip from Ottawa, Canada, to St. Helens, Merseyside. Our stopovers included Montreal, London, and sometimes Manchester. Going to my grandparents and spending the summer in England was one of the highlights of our childhood. My mother was an only child, and therefore, we were the only grandchildren. Our grandparents adored us. My grandparents, Dorothy and Albert, had met in grade school. My grandfather had become enamored by her at an early age. At a small dance party, organized by one of his older sisters, he had hidden her dancing shoes, so he would have a reason to see her again by returning them the next day. They were sweethearts and continued their romance when, at 14 years of age, it was time to go out into the world and get a job. My grandmother went to work in a doctor's house as a live-in nanny and maid. My grandfather went to work driving horses and carts as a carter for a local delivery and moving company. He drove wagons powered by huge Shire horses, which must have seemed like giants to his boy's frame. The skills he learned there would later put him in the Royal Army Veterinary Corps in World War II, which essentially kept him off the front lines and out of the trenches, although not out of harm's way. His knowledge of horses and animal care most likely saved his life. When in England, we always played with the two neighboring girls, Debbie and Juliet. We would spend hours in the Wendy House, a type of tent, snacking on the pears and apples that grew in the garden. Occasionally, we would venture out to walk the paths around the convent nearby. Sometimes we would visit the kittens and the neighboring farm. There was also the Knitting Club. 4 chairs were set out between the 2 houses under a set of trees, or indoors if the English summer didn't cooperate. It was there that I would guide all of the knitting projects and aspirations. My sister would have preferred a non-knitting club, but she did not want to miss out, so she reluctantly agreed. My grandmother would gift us with the knitting needles and scraps from her stash. In the evenings, we would all gather in the living room. My grandfather would smoke his pipe and eat mints, which were often shared with the beloved Yorkie dog named Tosco. My grandmother would sit on the couch with her knitting. She would tell us that every night she would do a certain number of rows so that her projects would be finished in time for Christmas. Beside her on the floor laid her basket of yarn. There were nights when either my sister or I would hold our arms up with a skein of yarn wrapped around until the blood ran out of them as my grandfather wound the future yarn project balls. This room was a cozy place filled with laughter and chatter and love. My grandparents were so happy with their simple lives, having been born at the end of World War I and having been separated for more than 7 years during World War II. They appreciated life differently. They never wanted more. Family was always the center of everything they worked for. After a glorious summer, Measuring Day came at last. Measuring Day would signal the end of our holidays, and we would know that time was growing short. My grandmother, along with my mother's help, would stand each of us on a chair in turn. While we stood there wiggling, the tape measure would be wrapped around our little frames numerous times, making sure that this year's measurements were accurate and precise. These measurements would be my grandmother's guide for another full year. For the many months ahead, she would knit matching sweaters, cardigans, hats, and mitts. At the sewing machine, there would be everyday dresses and skirts, along with a very special outfit for formal wear. For 12 years, until cancer took my grandmother at the age of 62, I would wear an entirely handmade collection of clothes made with a love so strong I can still feel it. There was never anything my grandmother couldn't make. To this day, I remember her smile while she worked away on items made purely out of love.